and your guests, collector Reza Ali Rashidian and Oris co-CEO Rolf Studer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out to the Dive Watch panel. I'm absolutely thrilled to be even just a part of this. We have an absolutely killer panel here for you. We're going to dig in on new and old dive watches, and there'll be a chance for questions in just a few minutes, so if something comes up that you're interested in, we'll get you a mic towards the end of the chat. All right, fellas, I think we're going to keep it pretty simple to start. Start with Jason. Why dive watches?
I think, for a couple of reasons, for me, the great history of diving watches going back to the middle 50s coincides with just an incredible era of exploration of the world, and I think the watches, these dive watches have been present at so many incredible historical events, and that juxtaposition of sort of precision engineering and durability, I think is very appealing to me. From kind of the historical standpoint, I think for me personally, as a diver, even though arguably dive computers have taken over from dive watches in regular use, that ability to take something that is a keepsake, a memento, something of precision engineering, and take it to extreme places and do incredible things with it, and then Monday morning be able to look down on your wrist and see it and have this tangible memento. You can't take your, I mean, you could, but your dive mask and your tank to work, I mean, you're not going to do that, but you can always look down on your wrist and say, the last time I was wearing this, I was diving a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean or something like that. I think those kind of two elements are what stand out for me.
Fantastic. And Rolf, why dive watches?
Well, they are beautiful. They are beautiful timepieces. They are casual in these down-dressed times. Often fits with your outfit. They're versatile. You can wear with a suit, you can wear with your jeans. They're very useful. If you fall in the pool, your cell phone won't work anymore, your dive watch still will. And they have high emotional value. It makes you think of doing something else than going to the office, being at the beach, being, just doing boys stuff instead of being in front of your laptop or computer. I think that's it.
What do you think? Why dive watches? Because you're obviously very, very into dive watches in a very special way. Certainly old watches. What's the appeal?
Well, I think there's an umbilical link between the specification of the dive watch and the birth of wristwatches. Wristwatches were born as a result of a need for not just a timepiece that told time, but an accurate timepiece and a rugged timepiece during a time of war, namely the First World War. And that's the watch that they would have wanted. And I think that in its nascent years, the specification of a dive watch was how that wristwatch became popular and wearable and approachable, because people wanted something that they could wear and never take off.
Right. And as we have transitioned out of a time, like Jason mentioned, where you even need a dive watch, or even in some ways we've blurred the lines between what is a dive watch and isn't. Is it the bezel? Obviously there's a specification to a strict dive watch, but it's not just water resistance. It's not just a certain functionality. What do you think it is about looking back at the past of those sorts of adventurous spirits that have led to kind of an enduring product category that it doesn't necessarily need to exist?
I mean, I think, as I said earlier, that link with, when you put on a dive watch, whether it's a Rolex, an Oris, an Omega, it ties you with this, you immediately are tied to this lineage of incredible exploits, and certainly that requires that you have a built-in sort of interest in that sort of thing, and some people don't, and that's fine, but for somebody like me and for a lot of people, clearly, because of how popular dive watches are, it's just this tangible link. You put it on and there's this connection with Jacques Cousteau and James Bond and just countless adventurers, both fictional and real, who have done incredible things with dive watches on. And if you can sort of channel even a little bit of that by wearing one, it can sort of bolster your confidence. For instance, you know, sitting in front of a group of people talking publicly might not be the most comfortable thing in the world for an introverted writer. But you know, wearing a dive watch that has been on adventures with me, it's almost a talisman or a good luck charm. And I can look down and say, I've been through far scarier situations than pretty much anything I'm going to encounter wearing this watch. So
Yeah.
I think it's part of that for me.
And Rolf, from like more of a product perspective, how do you find a way to connect you know, the legacy of dive watches with something that's sold today and has to be marketed to today's tastes? And obviously we've seen a growing and maybe in some ways even fading trend towards new vintage, where you have brand new watches that look like old watches. Where do you think the sweet spot is as far as connecting with people at a product level?
Yeah, I think it's really like you just said, it creates an emotional value. And the question, do you need a dive watch? Of course you need a dive watch because it makes you happy, right? That's the reason, basically, for any watch to wear, that it's, that it gives you pleasure. Mm-hmm. And with a dive watch, there's so many emotions coming with it, so many thoughts during your day. You look at your watch a number of times, and hopefully each of these times it makes you happy. A more technical dive watch for other reasons than a retro dive watch. Retro dive watches create these emotions of a Dr. No or a Goldfinger or I don't know what. Contemporary dive watches, more of actual diving. But up to everybody's liking, I think it's a source of emotion and a source of a 5 seconds break that you can have during your day as often as you want.
For sure. No, I would agree that it's definitely, you know, it's something that you buy, yeah, definitely not only because it makes you feel good, but it connects with these sorts of endeavors that maybe you're not always a part of or even a part of at all. Like a lot of people have dive watches and don't dive. And it speaks at a certain level to their collectability, which is, I think, what I would pass to you, Reza. Like, where do you find the collectability in dive watches? You're a preeminent collector of Rolex dive watches, and I know that you're interested in other watches as well. How do you define the collectability of a dive watch today?
Well, the thing is there's a sort of macro picture and a micro picture. The macro picture being the importance of the dive watch to the human condition, that sense of adventure that human beings like, the search for resources, and just the search for over-engineering. You know, you want to have something that can do much more than you'll ever do, mm-hmm. So you know that it's going to be reliable. And that's why I was making references to the First World War and later on in conflicts that you know, this watch it's got to be over-engineered so that it's reliable. Then there's the micro picture, which is, you know, it's just the sheer variety that you get on, especially in Rolexes, on the dials. Mm-hmm. So much so that it's kind of almost a game of spot the difference, because the design is classic. It's the oyster case, and if you have OCD, it's a fantastic thing to get involved. And if you don't have OCD, you will get OCD by the time you've started collecting.
So there's a certain amount of nuance within something that, you know, if you put them all on a table, someone, not us in this room, someone in a different room might just say they're all the same watch.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a recurring nightmare on that I show my collection to someone and I say, you know, can you see the difference? And they say no. And I say, well, here's a loop, you know, have a look. And can't you see the serif, the font's different, the crown's different, all of this kind of stuff? And they say, well, I still don't see it. And then I take the loop and look, and they're all the same in my nightmare. So,
that's
you know.
Oh, yeah.
The differences are minute in some instances.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously there's where you go into the hyper collectible range is where they have a very specific story.
Very specific.
And could you speak to a couple maybe highlights in your collection? Because there's some here, the stories are incredible.
In terms of the differences in the dials, or
or even just the model itself, you know, that has a great backstory.
The great backstory. I mean, the greatest watch I have, I think, in my collection must be the Deep Sea Special, #1. Right. Which was the watch that, you know, when Blancpain brought out their 50 fathoms in 1953, and they were claiming 100 meters or 97 meters. And Rolex themselves in 54 in Basel brought out the 6204, their first dive watch. Rolex already had a watch in 1953 that could go down thousands of meters. And in and by itself, that was a slam dunk for Rolex. I mean, they had already taken over the domain of the dive watch by having that watch and then embarking on the deep sea dive with the Trieste in 1960, where they went down, best part of 11 kilometers. So that is a watch that kind of has its own weather system. And it's a real dive watch, because if you actually wear it, it's so chunky that even if you go swimming, you'll go diving whether you want it or not. Take it down. So that I think is a highlight of any dive watch collection.
For sure. And when it comes to collecting, Jason, what's kind of your, as more of a, we'll call it a journeyman diver, watch collector, where's your perspective on collecting?
I have a few vintage dive watches, and I think I was going to follow up on Reza's comments, because I think what's interesting about collecting vintage dive watches, or even those from just a decade or so ago, is that you don't, especially with really old ones. There was a gentleman we just talked to 5 minutes before coming on stage who has an old 50 fathoms that he said belonged to a French fisherman for 30 years. Or was worn by a French fisherman for 30 years. Reza has an incredibly rare military submariner on his wrist. This gentleman in the front row has a Doxa that he bought recently from a diver, and he wears it surfing. These are collectible vintage pieces that when you hold them in your hand, they have to contain stories. I'm not saying this to diminish people who collect dress watches or complicated Pateks or something, but a dive watch is something that the stories are almost embedded in every scratch, every bit of patina, and it's almost a miracle that so many of them have survived to this day. And I think that, to me, speaking as someone who isn't really a true collector, is what's appealing about the old ones. And I think to have one or two really special vintage pieces, it just carries that appeal. Then when you leap forward and you look at how popular dive watches remain and what you can do with the new ones. And I think people are so careful with vintage watches and are so concerned about babying them or not washing their hands with them and things. And I think that watch that Reza's wearing has been through far worse things than we will ever be able to do ourselves here. From washing your hands to jogging on the street to sailing a boat or whatever you're going to do with it. So I'm all for, caring for them, but also wearing them.
Absolutely, and I mean, there's also a case to be made that in some scenario you create something that's collectible at a personal level by using it and wearing it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think you start to see some of the collectability that people find in new watches.
Yeah.
Which is kind of an interesting, kind of an interesting concept where you make that dive watch your own, and this goes with a lot of sport watches. Really, you might wear it through, run a marathon or run a Tough Mudder or something like that, and you have it on your wrist. Or when you get certified for diving, and it's interesting to kind of add those experiences to something that you bought, new from a store that you started at Stories. And Rolf, with you look at the success that Oris has had in producing like a considerable range of dive watch, like a wide style and a wide effect, and I've dove with several of them. I'm lucky to dive with several of them. And where do you see the kind of the fascination for dive watches reflected in the product?
What we just discussed, this emotional side, this adventure that's built into every dive watch. I think the success of bronze as a material for contemporary dive watches shows that very well, right? I wear my Carl Brashear that I've had for 3 years, and I just wear it in the ocean. And whenever I look at it, I think how I play with my kids at the beach, and it's my story built into this watch. And I think that's what people are looking for these days. A watch, it's disconnected from just showing the time. It's great that they show the time, but they are a source of emotion, a source of inspiration, and bronze, I think, is a material that shows that very well. And if you think back 20, 25 years ago, if you would have made a bronze watch, it would have found maybe a few enthusiasts, but it would never have been successful on a broad level because something that changes its appearance can't be a proper mechanical Swiss watch. And I think that example shows very well how the approach of consumers to watches has changed over the last few years.
I think it's interesting, and everybody here should check out that watch in person because the patina's wild. It's really cool. And but I do think it's interesting to contrast where maybe the initial fascination with dive watches was in the diving part of it, and I think now it's in the watch part of it. So it's an enthusiast-driven kind of sphere, and I think that exists at both the vintage level and obviously at the new product level. There's success on both sides. And Reza, where do you see new watches? Where do you see the transition point between new and collectible?
Well, I think there's been quite a few years now, quite a few decades, that the dive watches the specs on it have become so high that no human being can actually use it for diving. I mean, you can't go that deep. If it goes more than 700 meters, we don't have any evidence that a human being can survive it. So people buy these things as an exercise in over-engineering again. And it's like owning a car that does 220 miles an hour. You don't need to do it, but it's nice to know it can do 220.
You could go.
You could go, except that you cannot go physically, literally. I mean, you take the new Rolex Deep Sea, and you cannot go 3,000 whatever meters. So people buy it for the style and for the history. I think that you're buying a piece of history. There's a lot of lineage. There's a lot of stories behind that watch.
And by having that watch, you
By
can
having that
participate
watch,
in
you can participate in that story.
For sure. And when you consider kind of dive watches not only like as a category, but as kind of like an enduring presence in watch design for the past several decades and beyond, and it's interesting to think of them kind of beyond their emotional ability or anything, and more just as like now an element of style. And I don't know where that lands with any of you. Obviously, you've got so there is a certain lasting element of a Submariner as an item of style. Steve McQueen and all of these kind of icons wore them. And how do you think that speaks necessarily to just the presence of it even outside of diving?
Well, I think again, it's a watch you can put on and never take off. You can go to the beach. You can wear a black tie. You can wear your tux. It's so flexible, a dive watch, and I think it has a certain kind of, when you wear a complicated, say, Patek Philippe, it wears you, and when you wear a dive watch, it's almost your companion. That's the difference, I think. And if you wear a vintage one, you have all the history that goes with it, and if you wear a modern one, you still have all the history that goes with it.
Yeah, with it.
You have
as
one
a
of the
concept.
classics.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think dive watches have become, the form of the dive watch has become as part of our culture and sort of cultural heritage as a peacoat or a tuxedo or a pair of work boots or something. You see it, it's instantly recognizable from the strangest ones that came along in the 70s to a Submariner, to a Doxa, whatever. They have this very recognizable presence about them that when you see someone wearing them, and maybe it's my own romanticism, but it imbues the wearer with a certain, it makes them that much more interesting. You almost think if you're going to wear that watch, you must have some stories to tell.
For sure.
And just that. The very legible dial, the rotating bezel, usually kind of a burly strap or bracelet. It's just so iconic now that it's become like a wardrobe staple, or even beyond a wardrobe staple. So.
Yeah, for me it's similar as with the SUVs. Nobody or very little people really use their SUVs to what they are built for. It has become somewhat a lifestyle. Yeah. And the dive watches do exactly that same thing, right? They could do things that you would never do, but as men, we just like to have things that would be able to do things that you never do.
Yeah.
And fits in that same category.
Yeah, I agree.
And Rolf, it'd be interesting to consider, like, when you, obviously we spoke a bit about kind of the new vintage trend, and we see that in the Diver 65, but when Oris sets out, to design, say, a new watch, a watch that will be like distinctly new, like something like a Der Meistertacher, a modern sort of dive watch, how do you approach that to try and respect everything behind it, but without doing everything that's behind it necessarily?
Yeah, you can approach that from two sides. You can say, okay, these old pieces, they were nice. Let it be now, that was the past. Let's focus on the future. But also, as a brand, you're proud on your history. And I had this discussion at some point with somebody in Japan, and this person said, look, only brand with a history can do historical pieces. And that's very true. So you look at your history and you try to match it with today's possibilities. And often you get a product that is much more emotional than your standard product, because all these values, all these assets of your brand are in this watch. That's true with the Chronometer, that's true with the Diver 65, and it's a very nice way to showcase what you actually stand for, which includes also respecting your past.
Yeah, and it still can be reflected in a thoroughly modern product at some level, as long as the design is true to that history.
Yes, that's another interesting question. How do you do it when you do a vintage watch, right? Do you do it the same way as the watches were in these times? Do you use a plexicrystal, or do you use a sapphire? Do you use brass as a case material? Do you use stainless steel? We decided to use modern technology, but trying to keep the emotion. It's more about the emotion than about the object. As with many things, if you are able to bring that emotion across, people will understand what you wanted. And that's the case when we approach dive watches. With the Diver 65, for example, it doesn't have a ceramic bezel. Even this would be better than the aluminum bezel, but it would kill the watch. It has a sapphire crystal, but the sapphire crystal is nicely domed like the old plexiglasses. So then you try with all these elements, and you have lots of samples, and you just try to get to the point that you think the emotion is right, and then you know your product is right.
I think we've seen little murmurs of backlash against kind of the new vintage style watches. Some people are saying, oh, stop regurgitating. But I would argue that pretty much any dive watch creation these days is an homage to something old. They're all, dive watches are, there's a limited sort of palette with which you can design them and still call it a dive watch. And the fact that, people really aren't using dive watches to time dives much anymore gives this freedom to be able to kind of just sort of honor that sort of, or take a retrospective look, and it's kind of mechanical watches are obsolete anyway, so you might as well, every watch that we're all interested in, most of us in this room, is an homage to something old. It is a retro piece, just by its very nature. So
right.
I'm all for it.
Yeah. And Reza, where does that trend kind of land for you? The new vintage trend. Obviously, you love vintage watches. Do you find the fact, is it surprising to you that it's been this successful, or it makes perfect sense because you see kind of similar aesthetics?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I think that, and it's perfectly valid for a brand who's worked so hard to create an iconic piece to milk that.
Yeah.
Why not? If they can make it bigger and better and update it and still have the same style, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's actually good. It's like a 911. They keep doing new iterations.
Yeah, they always
same
seem
car.
to somehow make it better.
Make it better.
I know what you mean. And circling back on kind of your skill set, which would be collecting. And how long have you been collecting for people who maybe don't know your background?
Just over 20 years.
Okay. And so if you were to make a recommendation to a young guy or gal in the audience that's setting out, maybe they have a couple of new watches, maybe they have a couple old watches, how would you say, like, maybe not at a specific model or brand or anything, but how is it, what do you wish you had known 20 years ago that you know now?
I wish I'd known how much watches would cost today, so I would buy more.
Well, sure.
I'd just hoover up even more stuff. I think that you've just got to buy whatever you like and whatever interests you,
Right.
and enjoy it. And if as a part of that, that watch becomes a classic in the future, whether it's via your own experiences or via its rarity or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You've got to buy what you like, and then you're okay. You're enjoying it.
You take time, develop your taste, and just stick with things that you appreciate.
Stick with things you like yourself. That's my big. Just love what you own, rather than go on other people's advice and look at something and think, well, I don't really like that.
Right. But it's one that you have
Yeah,
to
what
buy
you have to
because you're
have,
in the
exactly.
mix.
I say just buy the stuff you like.
Rolf, what do you think? You've been in watches for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody wanted to kind of get into it now and skip some of the pitfalls or trying to understand, I mean, maybe it's easier to say, like, from your standpoint, what's surprising about the modern, like the current day watch buyer that people might?
Let me answer the first question first. I think it's really that. With whatever you collect, you got to start with what you like. And when you start with these things, you start to develop a taste, and then that will lead you somewhere. And that will lead you maybe to new watches, maybe to more old watches. I think, yeah, you should just go for what you like. You should not be blinded by brand names. You should really go for the product. You should understand what things are about, and then there's nothing you can do wrong. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to buying new watches, I think it's the same thing. Well, it's a free world. Buy what you like, right? And go for a product that makes you smile and that makes you happy. Don't go for the product that makes other people happy, but go for the one that makes you happy. And also, then I think there's nothing you can do wrong.
Right.
I think what's really cool about dive watches and collecting dive watches is that if you look at the kind of the first generation of dive watches that came about in the 50s, when diving was just becoming a sport of its own, you had these iconic, very few brands that were releasing them at that time. And then as that second generation came along from the mid-60s on, you started to see this explosion of creativity with every brand wanting a dive watch in its collection, because even in the 60s, it would have represented some of the same things we're talking about today, that adventurous sort of ambiance that it has, its ability to go places that nobody else could. So every brand was creating these, and you have these brands that are long since defunct that no one's heard of. You have that old Silvana,
Yeah, for sure.
from the 60s, and you just have all these wacky brands that you can collect, and they're as interesting visually, maybe not as important or collectible from a financial standpoint, but just from an interest standpoint. To find, for instance, one of the Oris dive watches from the 60s upon which the Diver 65 is based, it was one of those brands that at the time, they were, affordable, and people just were going to go out and actually use it diving, as opposed to when you get into the 70s and the 80s and the dive watch was sort of drifting further from actual use into more of a luxury product. And I think, I guess if I had to encourage somebody young, I'd be like, don't get hung up on brand unless you've got some money and you're willing to kind of put in the research, but seek out those quirky little weird dive watches, all sorts of dial colors and strange bezels and straps and everything that you see pop up in the mid-60s through the 70s. Those are the ones that I really like,
And I know, like, Jason, you and I have talked a lot about this, and I often wonder if there's something to the fact that a lot of guys' first watches are dive watches, or a dive type, a watch with a bezel and some water resistance and that sort of thing. And I wonder how much that speaks to just carrying on kind of a progressive lineage. I don't know, Rolf, if you guys see that, like, people buy Oris for their kids when they turn 18 or something like that, and if you see that kind of pass through generations, just the concept that, like, a good watch for a young man or woman would be a dive watch.
Yeah, as we discussed before, it's a watch that you can wear with everything. So it's certainly a good watch to start also a collection. And I think what's fascinating these days in the world of watches is what happened to it with social media. Actually, what brought us here today, right? A few years ago, there were some special interest magazines with a few 10,000 readers around the world, and now we have all these websites, we have Facebook, we have Instagram with millions of followers, of hashtags and brands, and it has become such an exciting community that the exchange with these people, at least for me, that's so enriching. It's so nice that this object watch, and especially dive watch, because they are the ones that are collected most, bring you in touch with all these people.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jason and I would say we couldn't agree more. I mean, it's largely I have a living because of this, and it's not something you would imagine necessarily. And it'd be interesting to compare that. When you first got into collecting, what was the scene like? Was there like 5 people that knew everything and they occasionally like put it on a forum, or?
No, we were 5 people who knew nothing, really, to start. Because, of course, especially with collecting Rolexes, Rolex was very reluctant to share any information at that time. And there's an event that I remember, we had a dinner and we all thought we were collectors and experts and all this. And I was wearing a military Submariner 5517 reference. And another guy was wearing a 5513, and he said, well, why is yours different? And we thought, well, what's different about it? So we looked at them, and mine had a maxi dial, but we had never seen a maxi dial until that point. So we learned at that dinner that there was a maxi dial. Now, of course, there's 4 variations, everyone knows everything. But it was kind of a pro-am affair when we started collecting. And it was a voyage of discovery, and a lot of the work was done actually by enthusiasts in the Rolex world, because again, the information wasn't forthcoming. And it was kind of an innocent time in a way, but plenty of scope to make mistakes as well. So it's good that there's more information out there now.
You figure today is not only more, do you think it's easier to ascertain good information versus bad?
I think so. I think because there's been a lot of cross-referencing of watches and cross-referencing of
more time to refine the information.
Absolutely, absolutely.
For sure. Well, you know, I think we can probably move on to questions. Are there a few questions maybe in the audience? We're going to have a couple microphones, so if you have a question, please put your hand up and we can get you a microphone.
I just have a comment about one thing I think you didn't suggest, was that dive watches are usually the most robust of whatever a manufacturer is making at the time. And they're a great, there's an advantage to wearing a watch that is so robust that you worry about what it might hit instead of the watch itself being damaged.
Sure.
And I've been collecting for 50 years, and my dive watches have almost been pretty much service-free. Because they tend to need service much less frequently than watches that have more air exposure. And air does not penetrate dive watches, especially when the real deep ones, very easily. So they stay less polluted in their movements.
Yeah, for sure.
I also bought both my boys dive watches as their first watch, because I figured, go ahead and go kill them, and we'll see how it goes from there. And they're both collectors now. Yeah,
certainly definitely one of the toughest wearing watches that you can buy today or collect at a certain level, because they were made to be indestructible. You know, as tough to kill as possible, and then they were, you know, theoretically worn by people that were also pretty tough to kill. Any other questions?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'd like to know what is your criteria of a dive watch, and why would it be better than a sports watch?
Better than a sports watch, just like a chronograph, or
What is a sports watch? I mean, I know what a dive watch is, I know what a field watch is, I mean, a sports watch.
you know he asked what's the difference between sort of what's the difference between a sports watch and a dive watch, and I think I was thinking about this earlier, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of another genre of watch that has an ISO, an international standard set for what you can call a dive watch. I don't think there is one there isn't certainly one for a driver's watch or a dress watch, or maybe there is for a pilot's watch. I'm not sure. I think there might be some standards there, but a dive watch, you have to follow a specific standard of legibility within 9.8 inches from your face set in total darkness, a way to track elapsed time, a minimum of 100 meters water resistance, et cetera. And on the other hand, I think nowadays, with people using dive watches less for actual diving, the criteria has loosened a little bit, and I think I like to think of a lot of these watches as sort of general sports watches or water sports watches, where you could wear it swimming on the beach, and then, you know, or sailing or surfing or something, you strip off your wetsuit, put on your trunks and t-shirt, and you can walk straight to the bar with the watch on your wrist and grab your beer, and somebody says, oh, you know, cool watch, and you know, hey, I was just out surfing with it, as opposed to dive computers just don't have the same panache wearing them. They're big and ugly and digital, and you certainly wouldn't be surfing with your Speedmaster. So
Maybe I can
Rolf,
add to that from a manufacturer's point of view. As you said, there is a ESO norm, there is a DIN norm in Germany that define what a dive watch actually has to be and has to do. And that gives you a totally different approach when you go into designing and making these watches, because you make them to these specifications. When you work on a sports watch, you know, that's themed to motorsports, for example, it can more or less be anything. Most likely it will be a chronograph. It'll have some kind of timing function, but that's about it. But with a diving watch, you really have these specifications that make it a diving watch, and I think that sets that category apart from other watch categories.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I think the line's blurred to a certain extent, especially as we've moved into like different materials. You can't say that it's just steel anymore. We have bronze, we have composite materials and ceramics and all these sorts of things. But I think that the idea is like, would it pass the test as a backup for your dive computer in that scenario where your dive computer failed? If it could, then I think you make the case that it's a dive watch, and then beyond that you have direct standards for companies that, you know, make the dive watch themselves. But I agree that like you can get a watch that doesn't have a rotating bezel that also does have 200 meters water resistance. You know, so that some of the law, like some of the rules, don't necessarily blend with some of the other rules. Any other questions?
I have numerous friends that collect dive watches, and there's always this controversy of should a dive watch be a chronometer? There are people that say, oh, it's a proper dive watch is no chronometer, maybe a date, but certainly the original dive watches were not chronometers. So I just wanted everyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, my gut says that like you don't time your dive by the second.
well, and a dive, typically, at least one you can time with a watch, is no longer than 60 minutes. So as long as it can keep decent time, you know, you don't need that 24-hour sort of accuracy range. It's not as stringent, you know. The Seiko SKX dive watch is arguably one of the most famous and most used one, and it's, at least my experience has been, it's got pretty rotten timekeeping. So,
When you spoke to standards, there was a magical standard for Omega when they qualified as the NASA watch. That made the company an incredible amount of sales and reputation, and beating that one test for NASA and being the only one that qualified back in the 60s was absolutely the biggest magic that ever happened to a watch company.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Reza, we were talking earlier, and you made the comparison between Trieste and that. Maybe speak to that. It's in a similar milieu.
Yeah, I mean, Rolex, I guess, did the Earth version of that, but except that, you know, the Moonwatch didn't need, because there was no pressure on it, essentially. There was just, you know, they could just buy a standard one pretty much and take it up there. The more interesting watch that Omega did was, I think, the Ploprof in terms of dive watches, where they just went for the monoblock instead of put a gas valve in it, and they got around the unidirectional bezel as well by putting a great big orange button and locking it.
Talk about dive specific.
Absolutely. So they had no gas escape valve, but I think that the watch looked so intimidating that it's not that the gas didn't get in. I think the gases were scared of the watch.
Definitely wasn't any space for it.
Exactly.
That's great. Any other questions?
One of the things we were talking about earlier was as diving becomes less prevalent and the watches become more robust in time, it seems like the only thing that's changing is it's almost like a cycle of reinventing the past design-wise. Is there anything that you would like to see in the future of diver watches?
I've always argued that the first dive watches of the early 50s pretty much got it 99% right, as evidenced by the 50 Fathoms that gentleman showed me earlier, and Reza's Submariner, and you know, the old Orises and all these others that you saw crop up in the 50s and 60s. It's almost there's not much more you can do. I mean, so I think brands are now, I hate to say it, a lot of them are inventing problems or inventing solutions for problems that don't exist. You know, I think you know that most of the early dive watches kind of got it right from the beginning.
Well, to some extent that may be true, but still you can do things better, and that's what drives our industry, right? Do things better that are already very good. And the future of dive watches, I think, materials will be important. Weight may be a factor. To me, also functions like a depth gauge, as we offer it in a physical way, just with a canal where the entering water compresses the air, solving actual problems giving you actual information that you need while diving in a mechanical way. That's something that pushes us. So I think, yes, a lot of standards are set, but are we there? I don't think so.
I actually think the future of dive watches has got more to do with bringing awareness to the plight of the oceans and our bodies of water. And I think dive watches should serve as bringing this tragedy that is happening right under our noses to for the public to take more notice of. And I think all the manufacturers should actually get together and actually have a program of bringing awareness through their dive watches to the compromising of our oceans.
Yeah, and that comes back also to the question of materials. For example, we at Oris, we have launched this summer actually a strap that's made out of recycled PET. And of course, it's not a huge amount of PET that you use, but you make people think about things. And you make people that may not be that close to these topics, when they buy a luxury watch, get into these problems that we actually have that threaten our oceans. And I can say that the additions we have done that are in collaboration with projects that actually serve and protect the environment, like the Clipperton expedition that we have done last year, like a watch for the Coral Restoration Foundation down in the Keys that we have done 2 years ago. They always have resonated very well, and I think that there is a lot to do for different brands. If they will ever find together to have one initiative, I doubt, but maybe it's also good to have some competition, so at the end the consumer can decide what kind of initiative he likes most.
I think it's an awareness thing, and like with anything with conservation.
Well, I mean, as a member of the Clipperton party, I was on that expedition actually. I can say that what I saw was truly disturbing, and I would fully agree that if there are resources that can be applied to protecting the ocean, and hey, if they could be paid for by dive watches, all the better. I like that idea. Any other questions? We've got time for maybe one more.
Hi.
Please.
Thank you for doing this. You were mentioning the specifications of dive watches and their functionality. I'm more of a vintage guy, so this is a pretty basic question. As the watches age and they lose their functionality, do they cease to be dive watches? You can no longer take them diving, you can't see the lume. It just becomes form over function at that point.
I think it's interesting that you know, in the collector community, it's often frowned upon that you have replacement hands or a relumed dial and these sort of things. And I would argue that with diving watches, a working diver who has owned a watch over a period of years, at least in the old days when luminescent paint would actually deteriorate and degrade, it was necessary to, if you wanted to maintain and keep this watch as a functioning diving tool, you would replace gaskets, you would replace the crystal if it was scratched so that you could see the dial, and you would have new hands put on or have it relumed in order for it to still continue to be a working watch. And you know, I remember I bought an old Omega or something at one point, and it had replacement hands on it, and I was upset by that. And then I've just kind of started to think differently these days and think, okay, if there's a legitimate reason for it, especially with a dive watch, all the better. But modern dive watches don't really deteriorate. I mean, because of materials like, you know, ceramics that are used for bezels, they don't scratch or fade. The super luminova lume just doesn't deteriorate like tritium, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the vintage watches, I wouldn't dive with them really. It's like kind of like sending a Vietnam vet back to war. You know, it's a bit unfair.
That's a fair point.
Yeah. So.
And I mean, if you're gonna take a vintage race car back to the racetrack, you would essentially make sure it's running as close to possible as the way it was when it was brand new, which may or may not change its value. So it's kind of two different worlds: the collector space versus someone who wanted to dive with an old watch. Maybe we do one more question. We had one more. We do too.
Yeah, I was just wondering if members of the panel could just mention which watch out of the dive watches that they have they prefer, and maybe the reason.
So which dive watches that we've got that we prefer?
I'm a big. I've got a couple of Rolex and Tudor Submariners in terms of vintage watches, and then. I've gone on record as being a real fan of Doxa, which is a brand you don't hear much about, but especially the vintage ones, you know, in the late 60s, they arguably sort of reinvented the recreational dive watch. It was sort of that second wave of diving watches that came along with the oversized minute hand, no decompression scale on the bezel, a clasp on the bracelet that would expand and contract to take up slack in a wetsuit sleeve. This was all done very deliberately, and it was kind of designed from a clean sheet of paper. And so, yeah, those are kind of my favorites.
Rolf, you got the one on wrist there?
Well, I used to have an old Breitling that I got from my father, and I took it apart, could never put it back together anymore, and then I lost the part, so that was sad. And now in the last few years, yeah, it's really my Culver shear that I wear on holidays, and I really cherish, and yeah, that gives me a lot of joy.
For sure.
I think it would have to be the military Submariner for me because of just the looks of it and the history, and wearing it on a NATO strap. I think it's a historic watch, and it's a fantastic looking watch at the same time as well.
I agree. I mean, you showed us this earlier when we were in the green room, and it's, I mean, it's something else as far as a vintage piece. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
And for me, I think if I'm taking a watch diving, I'll take a Seiko. I like a simple dive watch. I like one that if I bang it on a tank and it breaks, I don't have to feel like super bad about it. Arguably the Seiko that I would have that could go diving now is probably my most sentimental watch. I've had it for a long time. So I guess there's some problem with that math. But yeah, I like a good Seiko diver. And then as far as something a little bit more recent than that, yeah, I'm with Jason on, you know, I've had good luck with Doxa, and I've had multiple opportunities to dive with 65s and a Durmeister Talker and the Clipperton L or the Hammerhead LE. So I mean, there's a lot of great dive watches to choose from. I mean, you're kind of spoiled for it these days. There's something great at every price point. And let's do one more.
So dive watches don't tend to have a lot of complications, which is something that's come up earlier. But is there a complication that you rarely see or have never seen in a dive watch that you'd like to see or put in a dive watch? Thinking specifically like things like the depth gauge or the tides timer you see in like the old Abercrombie and Fitch dive watches.
I think the most useful complication, if any, is a depth gauge. I think it combines two instruments on one wrist. Oris has the Aquas depth gauge. I have an old Aqua Dive from the early 70s that was an electronic movement, but it had a Bourdon tube depth gauge. Of course, IWC has made them. So we've had a few over the years, but I don't like overly complicated dive watches. I don't think it's as necessary, but depth gauge would be my choice.
Rolf, what do you figure for putting a complication on a dive watch?
Yeah, there are dive chronos, right? Personally, but that's personal taste. I also like them pure and simple. I think a depth gauge makes a lot of sense, obviously. I think a locking feature for the bezel makes a lot of sense. Helium valve is nice, but doesn't really make that much sense for most people, right? So at the end, the dive watch should just be sturdy and simple, and that's it.
Any use for complications on your dive watches?
I don't think so.
Does a date at
You
this
might as
point
well
count?
just- no, you might as well just put a leap year in there. And,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, fair
That's
enough.
it.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, like I only really like one complication, that's GMT. So if you can get me another time zone, if you can throw it on the bezel, all the better, so you don't have to do anything with the crown. I think that, eventually that'll fail in a lot of watches. So 12-hour bezel can be nice, and some have kind of a split scale. You saw in some of the older stuff that gave you 12 hours along with the countdown, which is fun. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for attending the Why of Dive Watches panel. We'll be around afterwards if you want to continue chatting a bit, but we really appreciate you taking the time to stop by and listen in, and thanks so much for the questions. It's been a treat.
We would like to thank Audemars Piguet, BMW, Cartier, Grand Seiko, Oris, and Zenith for their support in making this weekend possible.